Hey, it's Mike here, and today we're going to investigate the mystery of why colorectal cancer cases have more or less skyrocketed in people under 50. We have many news articles talking about doctors not knowing why this is happening, and while there are certainly mysterious aspects to it, we can definitely gain some answers by looking into this. I will say it's not going to be a simple answer. You know, what are the factors that could be causing this? Could it be microplastics, have to do with the gut, or some of those other classic colorectal cancer risks? How does smoking compare to processed meat consumption, for example? I'll just give that one away. From this meta-analysis on younger cases specifically, processed meat was a worse risk factor than smoking for colorectal cancer. It appears those smoking and processed meat comparisons weren't so unhinged after all. So we're gonna look at over 30 studies in this video to try and get a clearer picture, and thankfully, according to the CDC, the majority of colorectal cancer cases are preventable through lifestyle modification, so at least we can start on that hopeful note. So let's get into it, but first of all, I just wanna say my apologies to anybody that's landed on this video because they or a loved one are dealing with this. That's rough, and good on you for seeking out information. I will say I believe that this could happen to anybody, but that still shouldn't keep us from looking at things that can lower risk. And specifically what we're talking about here is early onset colorectal cancer, which is under the age of 50. And while talking about this mysterious trend, yeah, we can see from the American Cancer Society, who used a cutoff age of 55, that the proportion of all cases under 55 has nearly doubled since 1998. Now, from cancer.gov, we're talking about the #1 cause of cancer death in men and #2 in women. But I think we need to zoom out here and first realize that this is happening in the face of some generally more positive trends. For example, the total colorectal cancer cases have gone down, likely due to less smoking as well as cancer screening. And with less smoking, lung cancer has sort of moved over to make way for another new top cancer. But yeah, this set of charts shows that in all ages, it's going down, but in the 20 to 49-year-olds, we see that notable increase, which is wild considering this is a time when smoking went down. From this Our World in Data chart, you can see that. And then you can also interestingly see that 20-year lag between smoking rates and lung cancer death rates. This is just a very important point that people often forget, that these chronic diseases have like decades of delay, which does apply to colorectal cancer. So we'll keep that in mind looking at the data. And what do we actually know about these people that are getting colorectal cancer? Well, we have a pretty big racial disparity here with Indigenous Americans and Black Americans at the top. And then white people are lower, and Hispanics and Asian Americans are the lowest. Men are also worse off. So, Hispanic women are like 2.5 times less likely to get colorectal cancer than Black men, for example. This increase does not appear to be genes. We can see the lower rates in Africa, as we will talk about in a really interesting study later. And from Yale Medicine, quote, "People also suspect genetics, but experts still haven't been able to use genetics to explain this surge." And my final general point here is, despite the surge in younger people, the amount of younger people is still dwarfed by older people. Like the vast majority, 80 to 90% of cases are still in those people over 50. Now I want to start by hitting on the topics that aren't discussed as much here. We're talking about microplastics and gut microbiome. And let's start with the gut microbiome here, which has a lot to do with inflammatory bowel disease as a potential related factor. From the study, having IBD means a 440% relative risk of colorectal cancer. So we have a bit of a triangle between gut microbiome and inflammatory bowel diseases like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's, and then colorectal cancer itself. And it makes sense. All this is connected to how much inflammation is on that gut wall. And that gut wall inflammation is closely related to the types of bacteria that you have. The more beneficial bacteria creates like a shield, a bit of slime there that can protect you in your colon. But then more potentially pathogenic bacteria can create byproducts that can help fuel cancer. From this study, quote, "The microbiome is involved in the carcinogenesis, formation, and progression of colorectal cancer." Also, according to this study, one of the main bacteria types that is connected to colorectal cancer is E. coli. This makes sense because E. coli is potentially pathogenic in the sense that it's literally a flesh-eating bacteria if it gets the chance. And obviously, some bacteria eating your flesh might lead to a little bit of inflammation. And then, of course, there's more inflammation, more DNA damage, more mutations, more potential for polyps, which then develop into actual cancer cells. And if E. coli is flesh-eating, then, of course, the more flesh you eat, perhaps the higher E. coli you'd have. That is hinted at by vegans having lower levels levels of E. coli in their gut. That could also be connected to how, of course, E. coli is an animal gut bacteria, and so we see it a lot of times on raw meats. And in terms of gut and diet, we've seen studies like this one within 24 hours eating, more animal products and less fiber can shift to a more potentially harmful gut bacteria population. But what foods could be doing good here? Well, I love beans, and so we got to talk about this awesome study by the American Cancer Society on beans in people with polyps. These people were either overweight or obese, and it was a crossover, so they had two groups who started out with either beans or not beans, and then they switched over to not beans or beans. And the results, quote, over the course of 8 weeks, there was an improvement in participants' gut health marked by an increase in beneficial bacteria. They also found that proteomic biomarkers of intestinal and systemic inflammatory responses, FGF19 increased and interleukin-10 receptor decreased. And low FGF19 is linked to inflammatory bowel disease. And we have another interesting study here on people with polyps or precancerous adenomas and whether or not they got those again or had more, and they tracked dry bean intake. And this is wild. For high versus low dry bean intake increase, the bean people had a 65% lower recurrence of advanced polyps. New song dropped, beans, beans, the more you eat, the less you cancer, all right? That's the new song from now on. Can't help but think that this might have a little bit to do with the lower Hispanic rates of colorectal cancer. Anyway, why might this happen? We're gonna have a whole fiber section in a little bit, but I just have to mention while we're on the gut subject, this study, which says, quote, fiber may reduce risk of premature death from all causes, whereas the whole non-digestible fraction from common beans exhibits anti-proliferative activity and induces apoptosis, which is programmed cell death, in vitro, which is a petri dish, and in vivo, or in live people's colon cancer. In the interest of not turning into Jack and the Beanstalk, I'm gonna cut the bean studies off there. And we're gonna talk more about fiber in a second. One of the main benefits here might be decreasing the transit time of poop through the colon, because the more toxins you got in there from whatever source, the longer that they're up against that colon wall, the more likely they are to cause some oxidative stress, DNA mutation, etc. So we don't want to be constipated here. And while constipation studies vary, possibly because a symptom of colorectal cancer can be diarrhea, which would totally mess with those numbers, at least from this study, those reporting a bowel movement every 6 days or less had an increased risk of developing colorectal cancer by about 2.5 times compared to those reporting greater than or equal to 1 per day. All right, we're gonna hit on microplastics in a second, but while we're still on the gut topic, I have to mention today's sponsor, which is Seed's DS01 Daily Symbiotic. This is a probiotic with prebiotics to feed those little guys, and we're talking again about a transit time here. We don't even need to talk about it in relation to colorectal cancer, just overall comfort and health and not being constipated, which is awesome. And in order to help you with that, this little guy has 53.6 billion active bacterial cell units from 24 different strains, scientifically shown to support various areas of health, from cardiovascular, dermatological, gut barrier, gut immunity, and overall digestive health, which is what we're gonna look at some studies on. This randomized control trial compared a strain in seed to placebo and found that it improves intestinal environment, defecation frequency, and fecal characteristics. Aren't you happy that your job isn't determining fecal characteristics? Oh, maybe you like that. Anyway, on to another randomized control trial. Found a similar result for that poo-poo quality. Looking at strains in seed, they reported a significant improvement in the number of weekly bowel movements, again, lowered transit time, consistency, and ease of expulsion. It's hard for me to be serious and talk about poop, but I will say, seriously, that Lindy and I have been taking seed for like 3 years now and loving the benefits. Lindy especially is obsessed with seed. And of course, if you would like to try it, feel free to click the link below and use the code MIC25, that's MIC25, for 25% off your first month's supply. All right, now let's get on to microplastics as a topic. There are various points that support the notion of it contributing, and then ones that are like, oh, that doesn't add up at all. For a supporting point, we have studies like these that take human colon cancer cells and expose them to microplastics. They found that high concentrations of polyethylene dose-dependently decreased cell viability and increased oxidative stress, not good. And from this study, we also see an increased microplastic content in colon cancer tumors compared to controlled tissues with about 3.5 times as much. However, this could be reverse causation for whatever reason. Maybe those, lumps and bumps down there are catching these digestive microplastics, or it could be, a metabolic issue where they're not being cleared as well. But the notion here is that there's an increase in plastic production, plastics in the environment, and increased exposure, so we should just see an increased risk across the board. But again, we are seeing a lower overall cancer risk. Maybe there's an effect here with screening catching some, even though there are more, but I don't think so. Especially when you consider that the highest increase in colorectal cancer is not in lower income countries. They're having the lowest increase, yet it's likely that they're being exposed to more microplastics in their environment just due to pollution. And this is, again, under 50, so this isn't like, oh, these are socioeconomically disadvantaged people that die before they get cancer. And looking to this study on 29 different countries, which at least looked at household exposure to microplastics. They found that those in low-income countries were exposed to the highest amount of microplastics, as one might expect. So that doesn't really make sense, but it was like zooming out, the microplastics narrative I think is really appealing here. I've seen it mentioned in several places because it allows people to just go, oh, there's nothing we can do. We're victims of just this increased plastic concentration in our environment. There's nothing I could personally do really to change this. It's just happening to me. But there are ways to even lower your microplastic exposure, which is a topic for another video. But it is the case that, if you're addicted to certain behaviors and you don't want to change them, microplastics sounds appealing. However, from the study, it appears that behavior and microplastics may work together because, as they say, microplastics may work with a high-fat diet to mess up colon wall function and increase cancer risk. Well, that's where I think we should move on to diet, because we did have a recent study looking at microplastics in various protein sources. And well, yeah, processed fish products were by far the highest. It is worth mentioning that some of those processed plant-based chicken nuggets, for example, were roughly the same as standard chicken nuggets. However, tofu was low, so my delicious tofu sandwich today was checkbox microplastic safe. So I had a whole video on how these pigs were being fed plastic, essentially, and of course the risk of microplastics in meat. Yeah, it doesn't matter what the original food is if it's being processed in an environment where microplastics are being added. But now let's look at some general risk factors for early onset colorectal cancer in particular. We have some good studies on that, like this one. See things that we would expect, like sedentary behavior. We see processed meat consumption. Of course, it's a carcinogen for the colon. Exposure to dusts, and then we also see lower risk with fruit and vegetable consumption, fish, which makes sense, less red meat consumption, as well as various plant vitamins. Then we also have this study, which puts high cholesterol at one of the main associated factors, as well as obesity. So I guess this is the point where I mentioned that vegans, average ideal LDL or bad cholesterol, and they, compared to other diets in the US, average normal BMI, they're the only ones that do so. And I think there's something to be said here with weight, because half of early onset colorectal cancer cases are in people who are either overweight or obese. This is where we have to look at just the overall lifespan of these people who are getting colorectal cancer younger, and we can see that, for example, childhood obesity just started spiking in the late 80s, and that's exactly the timeline that we're talking about for developing cancer that is finally coming to a head in the last few years. And we can see that from this timeline chart. We're talking about, decades here and there for different stages. So I think childhood obesity is a huge factor here, and that's why we absolutely need to be better at regulating not just the addictive chemicals that are put in food, but also on laws marketing food that is highly processed to children. And we can also look at general colorectal cancer risk factors here, because they're important too to get a picture. From this study, Western diet index was associated with 2/3 higher polyp chance, and their Mediterranean diet variation was down at about half as much. Mediterranean diet, of course, being lower meat, lower processed meat, and higher fiber. And this study found that substituting plant protein for animal protein, especially red meat protein, is associated with a reduced risk of colorectal cancer. And to this study, higher plant-based diet index meant lower risk. And this effect is really dramatic from this chart in men who, of course, have higher rates. Just look at that drop. That's insane with more plants. This is where we need to talk about red and processed meat, those colon carcinogens in particular, because one might have thought immediately, oh, it must just be those that's leading to this increase, but it could be more complicated than that. However, the connection is still very much there. Again, the WHO officially deemed red and processed meats as class 2A and 1A carcinogens. which always has people like, well, the WHO doesn't know anything. Their team of scientists that scoured over a ton of research is nothing compared to Joe Rogan's opinion. But again, processed meat was a powerful risk factor for early onset cancer of the colon, which is exactly what we're talking about here. But then we also have some interesting trends, like by race, for example, from this paper. Yeah, it appears that processed meat consumption by race directly tracks with who has the most cancer by race, with, you know, black people eating the most, followed by white people at half as much, and then Hispanic people at the lowest. And yeah, unprocessed meat has a role here, especially in black women. From this study, unprocessed red meat intake was associated with a 33% increased colorectal cancer risk per 100 grams a day, and over 2 times the specific rectal cancer risk. And from this study, looking at various dietary factors, yes, that red meat and various meat consumptions were associated with a much larger increased risk, like 2 times. But back to those legumes, half the risk. I think you're starting to get the picture here. But this brings us to that question, has processed meat even increased in a way that would match these younger people's rates going up? Well, it doesn't appear that in the general population that it has gone up. It stayed pretty much the same. However, we still have some data gaps. For example, we don't know if older people are eating less and younger people are perhaps eating a bit more. I mean, I can't help but think about the invention of Lunchables a little over 30 years ago. Lunchables are literally like processed meatables. Yeah, we just don't know how these different groups are eating. For example, with the increase of vegans and plant-based eating, maybe processed meat is going down in certain groups, but then it's maybe going higher in other groups, and those could be the groups that are at increased risk of colorectal cancer that we're seeing show up. But even if processed meat intake is staying the same, it's still possible that there are other factors that are making people more vulnerable to those carcinogens. For example, we know that heme iron plays a role in oxidation, potentially hurting the colon wall, but we know that chlorophyll buffers that effect. So if people are eating less green leafy vegetables, then they're gonna be more potentially exposed to those carcinogens. And this is where we really have to get back into fiber here on the topic of fiber, because as I mentioned earlier, transit time is playing a role here. So if you have those processed meat carcinogens right up against the gut wall for a longer period of time, they could potentially do more damage. So if 2 people are eating the same amount of processed meat, if one is eating significantly more fiber and has a shorter transit time, those processed meat carcinogens will have less of an effect on them. And this goes for any carcinogen that is going through your gut. Again, if microplastics are having an effect, this affects that. But we have to look at some general fiber studies because they are quite shocking. Well, the results do vary. From this study, we can see as much as a 50% reduction in colorectal cancer risk with high versus low fiber intake. And in terms of fiber and survival, I think it's really important to look at the actual people who have colorectal cancer, like this study in JAMA did. Found that patients who increased their fiber intake above pre-diagnosis levels had lower mortality, and each just 5 grams a day increase in intake was associated with a nearly 20% lower colorectal cancer mortality and 14% lower all-cause mortality. That's incredible, and I have to wonder, does that mean that if you hit like plus 30 grams of fiber per day, you just become invincible to death? You get 0% death? Forget the fountain of youth, how about the fiber of youth? But this is where we have to ask, does fiber meet up with the trends? And yes, it absolutely does. As you can see here, fiber consumption, particularly as a percentage of carb intake, has gone way down. Dropped right when you'd expect it to for an increased risk based on that timeline of colorectal cancer development, which takes decades. Simply put, generations who were raised in the last 50 years to some extent or another are going to be essentially some of the first ones with really low fiber intake across a longer period of time, across their childhood, which we could just be seeing the horrible results of. Now, without the fiber, we aren't protected from carcinogens, whether they're going up in exposure or staying the same. And there's also likely a racial component to this, and that brings me to this really interesting fiber swapping study that took people who were either African American or straight up African and swapped their diets, a low fiber for a high fiber diet. And right as the people mentioned in the beginning of the study, rates of colon cancer are much higher in African Americans at 65 per 100,000 than rural South Africans at less than 5 per 100,000. But some of that probably has to do with diagnostics and stuff. I mean, we're talking about a 12-fold difference in cancer rates. They straight up say the part out loud that most people don't want to hear, quote, "The higher rates are associated with higher animal protein and fat and lower fiber consumption, etc., etc." Over just 2 weeks of dietary swap, quote, "The food changes resulted in remarkable reciprocal changes in mucosal biomarkers," that's the mucous membrane of your colon, "of cancer risk, and in aspects of the microbiota and metabolome known to affect cancer risk." We're talking about significant changes in mucosal inflammation and proliferation. Yeah, they had an intestine wall proliferation or reproduction rate difference between these groups, and that's really important because cancer essentially across the board in our different organs. The risk of it from this chart is directly linked to how much cell turnover you have in any given type of tissue. The more turnover, the higher the risk. And so we can see from these images before and after where they've stained the amount of that cell proliferation, and you can see that it gets worse when people are put on the low fiber diet. It gets better when they're put on the high fiber diet. But that to me shows that diet and fiber in particular is directly related to one of the core causes of colorectal cancer. And then there are a couple other factors we just have to mention really quickly. One is alcohol consumption, which yes, is a risk factor for early onset colorectal cancer. However, it only accounts for like 20% from this Korean study. But this also doesn't seem to fit again because US alcohol consumption hasn't gone up in a meaningful way or really at all. And then of course we have just being sedentary. We saw that was a risk factor earlier, and it's quite clear from studies like this, even just looking at jobs and how sedentary they are, that over the decades we've just become more and more sedentary, which is unfortunate. However, this is likely only responsible for a few points difference in terms of risk. In the end, while this doesn't have a simple answer, this is a multifactorial disease with a lot of risk factors going into it. I hope you learned something from the 30+ studies, and it's clear that there are certain factors that are more speculative. You know, maybe it's the microplastics. You know, maybe there are age changes in processed meat consumption. We know that's a major risk factor. But then there are factors that are more clearly connected. We have just that fiber consumption, which can affect transit time and just how much damage carcinogens can do. These studies on how beans and fiber affect people that already have polyps or already have colorectal cancer is insane in terms of their survival or the recurrence of polyps being insanely lower, 65% lower with more bean intake. Imagine if there was a drug that lowered risk by 65%. Yeah, let's say whoever invented it would have been millionaires. Anyway, there are also those factors like being sedentary and childhood obesity, which matches up quite well. Again, all of these things, you know, maybe 10% here, 20% there, 30% there. The point is, again, the majority of cases could be prevented with lifestyle modifications. Anyway, if you would like to try Seed's DS01 Daily Synbiotic, you can of course click that link below and use the code Mike25 at checkout for 25% off your first month's supply. And also let me know what you think about all this down below. Were there any points I missed? I know there certainly were things that I couldn't fit in this video because it's already getting long enough. So pop those down below, and of course feel free to like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.